Hello, I'm Matt Sergio, proprietor of the Occult Beatles website and also Conspiro Media, a site that for almost a decade now has been focused on looking into clues, signs and evidence that the so-called counterculture scene of 1960s London was a social engineering project. And it's with this in mind that last month, April 2025, I purchased and read a new book that investigates and chronicles the work of the controversial British psychiatrist William Sargant, who, as head of a department within a general hospital in the middle of London between the 1950s and 1970s, was responsible for administering memory-erasing treatments on his patients. Treatments that would consist of a cocktail of drugs, ECT, short for electroconvulsive therapy, and enforced sleep. And if all that failed, a lobotomy. This was going on in a National Health Service hospital, in other words, one of the UK's publicly funded hospitals. If you're familiar with my work, then you might have read in an article or two of mine in the past, or heard me mention in a video or two of mine the name of Sargant and also his alleged links in the 1960s to state-sponsored mind control and, it's been alleged, a nearly father-in-law-to-be of a member of the Beatles. But I won't go into that just yet. This new book that I've been reading about Sargant is by Jon Stock, a novelist and journalist. He's written for the British newspapers The Observer, The Telegraph and The Times. This new book of his about Sargant is titled The Sleep Room, A Very British Medical Scandal. And the sleep room in the book's title is not some metaphor that Stock has employed. It's named after the room in that state-funded hospital where Sargant's patients would lie in enforced sleep. Ward 5 of the Royal Waterloo Hospital. To quote from the book's prologue and also the first chapter, "The windows were covered with blinds. At a desk sat an upright student nurse, trying to ignore the moans and the smell of stale bodies. Occasionally she glanced at 6 young women asleep on low divan beds wrapped in candlewick covers, small wooden chairs beside them. Were they dreaming? She hoped to God they weren't. Their lives were already a nightmare. For the 6 women, day and night no longer held any meaning. Time had long since disappeared, extinguished by a potent cocktail of antipsychotic, sedative and antidepressant drugs. The woman below the window, a young mother of 3 children, had been admitted with postnatal depression. She had been there for 7 weeks now, asleep for at least 20 hours a day. Beside her was a 21-year-old woman diagnosed with anxiety after a row with her parents over a new boyfriend. It was here, on Ward 5, that female patients, for they were almost always women, were put to sleep for 3 to 4 months, only aroused from their beds to be fed, washed and given ECT. When their treatment came to an end, these women would barely know who they were. Their memories, the good and the bad, would have been erased forever, the slate wiped clean. In the research of this book, the author Jon Stock spoke first-hand with some of the patients who were sent to the sleep room there on Ward 5 of London's Royal Waterloo Hospital back in the 50s, 60s and 70s. Their accounts are featured in the book, as are the first-hand accounts of some of the nurses and other staff members at the hospital at that time. One of the former patients who spoke for the book is Anne White. She was admitted to the Royal Waterloo in March 1970, aged 28, a mother of 3, who was suffering from depression and had attempted suicide. She claims that she was told that her brain needed a rest and that sleep would obliterate the negative feelings that she experienced when she was depressed. But what they didn't tell her, she claims, was, and to quote her, that I'd also received 26 electric shocks that wiped my memory. She spent just over a month or so at the Royal Waterloo, and as well as the 26 ECT shocks, she was administered with a cocktail of drugs, as well as spending time in the sleep room. When she left the Royal Waterloo, she claims that her brain was cleaned of anything that happened before she was admitted to the place, and that includes her childhood. She has no recollections of who her school friends were or her teachers, and she can't remember anything at all about her own children when they were babies. It's all gone, she claims. You know, those first little moments that people normally rejoice in, first steps, first words, nothing. It's all gone. A woman who in Jon Stock's book goes by the name of Ruth Chadwick, not her real name, she wanted to protect her privacy, was treated by Sargant as an outpatient in the nearby St Thomas's, an NHS hospital which was amalgamated with the Royal Waterloo. She also claims the ECT destroyed much of her memory. For a while, I couldn't even remember my own name, she claims, and her friends said, so Jon Stock claims in his book, her friend said that she'd undergone a personality change. Often, when reading the accounts of many of the patients who were treated by Sargant in the Royal Waterloo, one of the words used to describe their state is zombie. Family members who came to visit would say the person sitting there in front of them, whether it was their wife or daughter, looked like a zombie. Another woman admitted to the Royal Waterloo, Mary Thornton, who was being treated for acute anxiety back in 1971, had recently trained as a nurse and as a result managed to recognise within the confused haze of the ECT shocks that she'd been given some of the drugs that she was given, most notably sodium pentothal and sodium amytal, known truth drugs. Why were they using a truth drug on me, she asks in the book. Why indeed? My long-held suspicion is that Sargant may indeed have been working for secret intelligence. It wouldn't take too much stretch of the imagination to think that. However, as Jon Stock states in his book, there's no absolute concrete proof to confirm that Sargant was secret intel. And it doesn't help that, as Jon Stock writes, and I quote, some of the medical records of patients who passed through the sleep room have disappeared or been destroyed. However, in his book, Stock offers up strong indicators that Sargant was involved in some way, shape or form with British intelligence, as well as the CIA, back in the days of the so-called Cold War. He quotes former British Conservative Party politician Rupert Allison, who, under his pen name Nigel West, has written numerous books on intelligence, secret service and espionage issues, and who, according to his website, has lectured for the CIA and the NSA, America's National Security Agency, and who's been dubbed, and I quote, the unofficial historian of the secret services. In Stock's book, Allison, aka West, is quoted as saying that yes, Sargant was, and I quote, undoubtedly on the list, an index of approved professionals and contractors who are cleared to work for the intelligence services. I know, West is quoted as saying, that Sargant took over from British psychiatrist Harold Dearden as MI5's go-to psychiatrist, someone whose services they could call on 24 hours a day to assess the mental health of employees or, occasionally, potential defectors. An author who gets quite a bit of attention in Jon Stock's biography of Sargant is Gordon Thomas. Thomas is alleged in a couple of books, well, in at least a couple, according to my knowledge, that Sargant was indeed working for the intelligence services and that Alan Dulles, who was CIA director between 1953 and 1961, regarded Sargant as, and I quote, Britain's leading medical expert on communist methods of eliciting confessions. This is a quote from Thomas's book, Journey into Madness, and that Stock quotes in his biography of Sargant. What helped to bolster Sargant's standing within the intelligence community, Stock writes, was Sargant's book, published in 1957, Battle for the Mind, The Mechanics of Indoctrination, Brainwashing and Thought Control. It's a study. The book is a study of ways in which the mind can and have been manipulated, including a chapter that takes it right back thousands of years, a chapter titled Brainwashing in Ancient Times. But the majority of the book is focused on the then present day. There's chapters on the use of religion and politics to control the mind, and reminiscent of what Dulles is alleged to have said that Sargant was the leading expert on, a chapter titled The Eliciting of Confessions. in which Sargant goes into the methods employed by police forces and also the military across the world to successfully elicit these confessions. He also details the notorious work of Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, notably his experiments in the early 20th century on dogs and their behaviour after subjecting them to, in Sargant's words, stresses and conflict in order to alter that behaviour, partly achieved by depriving the dogs of food and subjecting them to electric shocks. And to quote from the back of the book, and I quote, "The object of this remarkable book, The Battle for the Mind, is twofold. One, to show how beliefs, whether good or bad, false or true, can be forcibly implanted in the human brain. And two, to explain how people can be switched to arbitrary beliefs absolutely opposed to those previously held. The science of brainwashing. In detail, the author describes the methods used to achieve these ends by politicians, priests, psychiatrists and police forces the world over." There's a report that Stock mentions in his book, a once classified report from 1951 by Harvard professor Henry K. Beecher, an anesthesiologist who it's claimed was working covertly for the CIA. In this 1951 report, Beecher summarised a trip that he made to Europe that year, and in which he identifies and recommends various civilian doctors and psychiatrists that the US intelligence community could join forces with on a top secret project to control and influence human behaviour. One of the recommended on his list is William Sargant. And that top secret project, 2 years later, came to be known as MK Ultra. And this brings me back to the earlier mentioned Gordon Thomas and more of his allegations linking Sargant to the intelligence services. Stock, in his book, mentions that Thomas was a former war reporter and an investigative journalist who actually knew Sargant, had first encountered Sargant in the 1960s, whilst Thomas was working as a TV producer at the BBC. Sargant was quite a regular guest on BBC TV programmes where he was called in to give his expertise on issues of the mind. Stock writes that Thomas knew Sargant better than any other journalist or author, living or dead. Thomas had apparently met Sargant up to 20 times and had personal access to his private diary and correspondence. Citing another of Thomas's books, Secrets and Lies, A History of CIA Torture and Bioweapons Experiments, Stock, in his biography of Sargant, notes that, according to Thomas, Sargant attended a cocktail party in Washington in 1954, hosted by Alan Dulles. And after the guests went home at around 10:30 that night, Sargant was asked to stay put and was then invited into the CIA director's study for a private conversation along with future CIA director Richard Helms and the head of the CIA's MK Ultra program, Sidney Gottlieb. Also, throughout Stock's biography of Sargant, the Scottish-born psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron keeps popping up. Cameron, of course, whose name is inexorably linked to MK Ultra due to his particular methods of treating patients at a psychiatric hospital in Montreal, Canada during the 1950s and 60s. There's an entire chapter on Cameron in Stock's book. Cameron, who Stock refers to as Sargant's, and I quote, personal friend. Stock also makes the observation that Cameron and Sargant treated their patients in a similar manner. Cameron had a sleep room as well, and he too used ECT and drugs, including LSD, which at that time was still largely unknown to the wider population, still largely a drug used within the military intelligence complex as well as within the confines of psychiatry. To quote Stock, Cameron was given carte blanche to dismantle the human psyche until nothing was left, and then to reprogram it. Stock Once again, quoting the research and allegations of the earlier mentioned Gordon Thomas, reports that it was largely thanks to Sargant that Cameron learnt how to, and I quote, strip patients of their selfhood and introduce into their minds what he wanted them to believe. Stock also quotes from private correspondence between the two doctors, letters that are in Ewan Cameron's archive collection. Many of the letters concern matters arising from their membership in the World Psychiatric Association. Both Sargant and Cameron actively helped to organise and stage the association's public talks and conferences, helping to find sponsors for the events as well as speakers and organising the publicity. So Cameron and Sargant were not strangers to each other. Furthermore, in the US editions of Sargant's autobiography, The Unquiet Mind, published in 1967, the preface, to quote Stock, carried a glowing preface written by Cameron himself. Others who worked closely with Sargant, who you might raise an eyebrow at, include Elliot Slater. He was Sargant's clinical director at the Belmont Hospital, otherwise known as the Sutton Emergency Hospital. This was during the Second World War. Slater, writes Stock, was a member of the British Eugenics Society and in the 1930s won a fellowship from the New World Order friendly Rockefeller family, and that saw him going to Germany and studying under psychiatrist and geneticist Ernst Rudin, who, to quote Stock, spearheaded the Nazis' program designed to encourage a pure and healthy Aryan race by miscegenation and procreation among mentally ill people. Slater and Sargant were friendly enough to share a house together with their wives in London for 8 years. And it might interest you to learn that Sargant was also awarded a Rockefeller Fellowship. Someone else who Sargant worked closely with was psychiatrist Peter Daly, who was Sargant's research registrar at St Thomas's, according to Stock, who also claims that, and I quote, went on to work for MI6. Furthermore, to quote Stock, quoting Daly, experimentation took place at the Royal Waterloo Hospital in whether or not we could get confessions from people who were suspected of this or that. On the board of governors at St Thomas's was one of Sargant's dearest friends from their days together at Cambridge University, John Harman, father of Harriet Harman, who became deputy leader of Britain's Labour Party when it was in government under then Prime Minister Tony Blair and his successor Gordon Brown. She was also, decades earlier, in the 1970s, a member of the National Council for Civil Liberties, an organisation that became aligned with PIE, PI, short for the Paedophile Information Exchange, a group that actively promoted sex between children and adults. Also, another name worth mentioning, back at the Royal Waterloo in 1965, a doctor who was training under Sargant's supervision at that time, one David Owen, who would later go on to become a high-flying British politician, becoming Foreign Secretary between 1977 to 79, and is now Lord Owen. Also, as a point of interest, Owen, in Stock's book, expresses little doubt as to whether or not Sargant was working with secret intelligence. I'm sure he was linked, he's quoted as saying. MI6 and MI5 take some of the best of the London top consultants in all their areas of speciality. What with Lord Owen having once been a foreign secretary, he should be well qualified. He should know what he's talking about there. It has been alleged, although never conclusively proven, that the intelligence services valued a particular speciality of Sargant's, his apparent mastery in the art of hypnosis. Stock describes Sargant as, quote unquote, an adept hypnotist, and then goes on to quote Sue, a student nurse at the Royal Waterloo, who says she was hypnotised. She was actually hypnotised by Sargant, so she claims, when he was giving a talk on the subject to a small group of nurses at the hospital. And this brings me on to the earlier mentioned nearly father-in-law-to-be of a Beatle, you know, who I mentioned right at the beginning of this. I'm talking here of Dr. Richard Asher, father of the English actress Jane Asher, who between 1963 and 68 was involved in a long-term relationship and was briefly engaged to Beatle Paul McCartney. Dr. Asher was an eminent London-based general physician and the author of an article featured in the British Medical Journal titled Respectable Hypnosis, in which he called for hypnosis to be taken seriously as a treatment, before going on to reveal that he himself had been using it on his patients for a number of years already. Now, none of this is mentioned in Jon Stock's biography of Sargant. Indeed, Asher isn't mentioned in it at all, but I'm mentioning Dr. Richard Asher in the same breath as the notorious William Sargant here, because it has been alleged, although never proven, that the two of them, along with Tavistock Clinic psychiatrist Emmanuel Miller, were involved in British-based MK-Ultra type experiments on young people back sometime in the 1960s. This is an allegation that was brought forward by an unnamed source was brought to the attention of Redwell Trabant, proprietor of the occult conspiratorial flavoured Beatles blog Beatles Conspiracy. And here's just a taste of that allegation. Asher, Miller, Sargant, all three were top psychiatrists. I worked with them all. I began helping med professors train nurses doctors at 12 years old. There were many kids, not just me, but I only met two others. They decided I was suitable and flexible and asked me to help with research. Some illegal stuff, but they needed to explore even these areas. Basically, they were into learning how the brain worked, but they were into other things too. Most of the time, I didn't know what they were getting up to. It was all mixed up and above my head, but they fed me well. They got into drugs as they knew it was becoming a problem. The police wanted to train cops to deal with it, how to work out what drugs they were on, etc. They supplied the drugs and were observing the tests most of the time. Sargant was different from the others. He was an outsider. The others didn't let him in on all they were up to, but they needed his input at times. They never spoke of it to me, but all did work for the government at times. What I do know is it's not necessary to hurt or drug people to brainwash them. Sargant had to, as he wasn't blessed with the psychic abilities Asher and Miller possessed. All were able to read minds, telepathy, deep hypnosis. No kidding, mate, for they were using this on me to get deep into my mind to understand how it all worked. Strangely, they all could do it, but nobody knew how it worked. It was passed down by word of mouth over the centuries to those who exhibited a talent for it. Sargant wasn't so blessed. He could do hypnosis, but only level 1, the one we all know about. That allegation in full is available on the Beatles Conspiracy website, which you can find at beaconfilms2011.blogspot.com. That's beaconfilms2011.blogspot.com. And from the Beatles to the Rolling Stones. Well, sort of. In Stock's book, there's a complete chapter focusing in on the recollections of Linda Keith. Back in the 1960s, she was a fashion model and was for a time the girlfriend of a Stone, of Keith Richards, before leaving him for Jimi Hendrix. In early 1969, she was admitted to Ward 5 of the Royal Waterloo, largely thanks, she says, to the pressure of her parents, who, she says, wrongly referred to her as, quote-unquote, being ill, when what she really was, in her words, was a wild child of the 60s, a pleasure-seeking, music-obsessed drug addict. What her parents wanted her to become, she claims, and I quote, was a tame, house-trained lapdog. And she balked when they sought out the help of, in her words again, William Sargant, champion of the lobotomy and ECT, in order to make this transformation possible. What on earth were they thinking, she asks. Well, there's every possibility, I suppose, that her father knew Sargant personally. Linda's father, Alan Keith, was a well-known radio presenter on the BBC, and given that Sargant was one of the BBC's go-to talking heads when it came to looking for expert knowledge on psychological topics during the 1950s and 60s, it could well be that the two men might have previously met before Linda became Sargant's patient at the Royal Waterloo. In Stock's book, Linda goes into detail about what little she can remember of her time on Ward 5. She claims she can't remember being admitted to Ward 5 or being put to sleep in the notorious sleep room. All I know, she says, is that I didn't wake up for 6 weeks. She was, to quote her, woken every few hours, she says, to go to the loo and be fed. It was a twilight world, she says, and I have a tinge of fear, even now, as I force myself to think about it, the enormous amount of ECT that I was given. Looking back at her life, at her days before her parents persuaded her to be admitted into the Royal Waterloo under William Sargant, in Stock's book, she takes the reader back to her early teenage years when she fell in love with music, most notably black music, whether it was R&B or blues or ska and blue beat or the rock and roll of Chuck Berry. She first met Keith Richards when she was 17 and he was 19. She was working as a model at this stage. A couple of years or so later, whilst accompanying Keith on a Stones tour of the US, she first met the then unknown Jimi Hendrix playing in a club in New York, and for a time, in her words, she was still with Keith and just having a good time with Jimmy. She stayed on in the States with Jimmy when Keith and the rest of the Stones returned to the UK, and whilst she was in the US, she got more and more involved with drugs, taking acid, and in her words again, she'd started to use a needle. Back in England, meanwhile, Keith and Linda's father got together and arranged, without Linda's knowledge, to have her brought back to Britain, which they did. Linda's father turned up in New York one day when she was tripping on acid and escorted her back. Her relationship with Keith broke down and ended after this, as did her relationship with Hendrix after he began seeing another woman, and her downward spiral into drug dependency continued, leading her eventually to Ward 5. To quote from Linda from Stock's book, "My time in the sleep room left me hugely incapacitated. I couldn't make any decisions on my own. I needed help to choose what clothes to put on in the morning. Most shocking of all, I could no longer read. I recognised letters and words, but they made no sense to me, so I just gave up. I wasn't happy or unhappy. I wasn't there. It was as if my brain and personality were dead." Eventually, she says, she learnt to read again. She taught herself to read again, initially by looking at picture books designed for 3-year-olds. A number of what you'd call well-known names passed through the doors of Ward 5. Linda Keith was by no means an exception. One of the most well-documented is that of British actress Celia Imrie, perhaps best known for her roles in hit movies including Calendar Girls, the Bridget Jones film series, Mamma Mia, Here We Go Again, and many, many more. She was admitted into the Royal Waterloo under Sargant as a teenage girl suffering from anorexia. And in 1967, the then former British Member of Parliament, Lord Boothby, was admitted to Ward 5 for a drink problem. He was a notorious figure who was friends with London gangsters, the Kray twins, during the 1960s. Now, often, very often, in the so-called alternative media, within the realms of websites such as mine, for example, Conspiromedia and the Occult Beatles, mind control, MK Ultra, the control and alteration of the personality of stars of music and screen in the pursuit of social engineering and what we call the occult, it's a constant. And I see shades of this in the career of William Sargant's. Sargant wrote quite extensively on the occult and how he could apply it to the control of the mind. He explored this in his 1973 book, The Mind Possessed. According to Stock, Sargant, and I quote, had become increasingly interested in possession, mysticism, trance, sexual ecstasy, and faith healing, all of which explored in The Mind Possessed. This interest, Stock writes, was bolstered by visits and holidays to Africa and the American Deep South. Now, just how far he took this interest in the occult was, Stock points out, the focus of a series of articles, an expose, if you like, that was published in the 1980s. It quoted none other than Alex Sanders, British-born founder and leader of what's called Alexandrian witchcraft. It's claimed that Sanders, after meeting Sargant at a TV studio during the 1970s, where the conversation between the two of them turned to sex rites performed by practitioners of the pagan religion Wicca, was then asked by Sargant if Alex and his wife Maxine would like to come back to his house for dinner so that he could watch them have Wiccan sex so that he could take photographs of their eyes. Take photographs of their eyes, okay, at the point when they reached orgasm. Alex, it's claimed, turned down this invitation. Actually, Sargant has been accused by former patients of sexual abuse. Linda Keith claims that after being released from the Royal Waterloo during an outpatient appointment at Sargant's practice in London's Harley Street, he hugged her and kissed her on the mouth, at which point she broke free and hit him as she made a swift exit from his office. Elsewhere, a registrar who worked with Sargant recalls a time when a medic walked into a patient's bedroom and found Sargant kissing the patient and saying as he walked out of the room, "That's the way to cure a patient." Then there was a complaint filed against Sargant in the 1980s accusing him of initiating and engaging in an inappropriate sexual relationship with a patient, and whose medication was brought into question as well due to side effects and the dosage prescribed. Another patient who was placed under Sargant's deep sleep treatment complained of pains, in her words, in her pelvic groin area after coming around from narcosis, and later on when attending outpatient appointments at Sargant's office in Harley Street, where he tried and failed to make sexual advances on her, she began to wonder whether the pelvic pains she'd been experiencing in the hospital had actually been caused by Sargant raping her while she was in her narcosis. Sex was a subject that Sargant, as I mentioned before, explored in his book The Mind Possessed. He also delved into the mind-controlling effects of music. For example, in The Mind Possessed, he goes into some detail about the Samburu, a Kenyan nomadic tribe, and I quote, "The Samburu are very subservient to their tribal and group leaders. There are, as usual, initiation rites at puberty in which both male and female adolescents are broken down as individuals and then re-indoctrinated with the special beliefs and social behaviour patterns required of them by the custom of the tribe. Their initiation rites are undoubtedly very powerful in their effect, and once the young people have been broken down and indoctrinated to accept the tribal values, religious and social, they remain sensitized to what might be called agents of disruption. If deviation occurs, this may be dealt with by the arousal of fear and the use of drumming and dancing to induce trance. He must unquestionably accept the validity and fairness of tribal ideas and tribal group behaviour. All this resembles the English public school system of indoctrination, in which boys are rapidly broken down and re-indoctrinated to accept the school's values. Similar indoctrination techniques are used in armies, especially in crack regiments. What I wanted to study, states Sargant, among the Samburu was their dancing, which is often carried to the point of trance and collapse. Talking to some of the young Moran, or warriors, through an interpreter, I was told that the effects of their dancing were twofold. Firstly, after dancing themselves into a trance, and especially after the collapse phase, the Moran lost all fear of fighting. Trance and greatly increased suggestibility made them immune from normal fears and doubts about going into battle. A second and surprising but extremely important effect was that trance and collapse freed them from any dangerous resentment. which they might have built up against their leaders. In effect, dancing is used specifically to alleviate resentment and hostility, which naturally builds up against the tribal leaders and the customs and conventions imposed by society on the young. It was most illuminating to see how the Samburu had found and for centuries maintained this method of keeping control in the hands of the few. It seemed to me, continues Sargant, that civilised men may have to go back and study primitive methods of keeping the majority of people in a state of comparatively cheerful subjection to unequal and often grossly unjust political and social systems. I was now beginning to understand better how Hitler, for instance, had been so successful in using mass rallies, marching and martial music, chanting of slogans and highly emotional oratory and ceremony to bring even intelligent Germans into a position of intellectual and emotional subjection, or how the new youth culture of the West, based on frenzied dancing to the pounding, repetitious beat of very simple music played at almost intolerable volume, has helped to create the permissive society and to bring down in ruins a whole structure of beliefs and conventions cherished by the elders of our society. We see in Western countries today, in fact, the same dancing and whirling to a powerful beat, carried sometimes to states of exhaustion and semi-trance, which is little different from what I saw in Africa. From the Stone Age to Hitler, the Beatles and the modern pop culture, the brain of man has been constantly swayed by the same psychological techniques. Reason is dethroned, the normal brain computer is temporarily put out of action, and new ideas are uncritically accepted. This reference in The Mind Possessed to the Beatles and the Beatles' power over the mass mind is also picked up on by Stock in his biography of Sargant. He quotes this passage from The Mind Possessed. And from The Mind Possessed, I thought you might be interested to see this photograph. This is from the book The Mind Possessed, a screaming Beatles fan, and underneath the caption, Beatle Possession. And with regards to the Beatles and the permissive society and the Western youth that Sargant refers to, I think this is a good point to turn the attention towards an individual by the name of Stephen Abrams. He's mentioned in Stock's biography of Sargant, and Abrams, for me, is a key person. If you're of the view that the 60s so-called counterculture scene of the UK was a psyop, a social engineering exercise, helped into being by secret agents posing as counterculture heroes against the establishment, then, as far as I'm concerned, Abrams bears the classic hallmarks of one of those. In terms of his public persona, he's been dubbed a key member of the 1960s counterculture scene of London. He was known publicly in the 1960s as a vocal campaigner for the legislation of marijuana. He's the man credited with masterminding the advertisement in the super mainstream British newspaper The Times in 1967 calling for the legislation of marijuana, and the ad was paid for by Paul McCartney, and a number of well-known people signed it, added their name to it, but beneath that public face, behind that apparent rebellion, was someone steeped in the establishment. Born in the US, Abrams was a trained psychologist, a parapsychologist who spent a majority of his years in Britain at Oxford University, no less, where he headed a parapsychological laboratory investigating extrasensory stimulation of conditioned reflexes in human subjects under hypnosis. His studies at Oxford were part funded by the CIA via the Human Ecology Fund, which was a secret fund organisation for the CIA's MKUltra programme. Abrams has been on my radar for quite some years now, and Jon Stock, in his biography of Sargant, has actually alerted me to some information I wasn't aware of with regards to Abrams. That being that in July 1961, just before Abrams got his funding at Oxford, He passed through Washington Airport, and when he was there, whilst he was there, he phoned the office of then CIA head, the previously mentioned Alan Dulles, and spoke to someone who arranged for Abrams to meet Richard Lashbrook, who was then the deputy head of the MK Ultra program. And yeah, Abrams and Lashbrook met at a coffee shop at the airport, where Abrams asked if the CIA would fund his forthcoming trip to meet fellow parapsychologists in Russia. And according to Stock in his book, the CIA declined this request. Jon Stock is of the view that Sargant may also have been receiving human ecology funds, especially with regards to his sleep room. A number of well-known names added their signature to the double-page advertisement in the Times newspaper, including the Beatles, also their manager Brian Epstein, activist Tariq Ali, novelist Graham Greene, BBC broadcaster David Dimbleby, and Francis Huxley, nephew of eugenics and New World Order supporting Aldous Huxley, and also author of Aldous Huxley, of course, was also author of the book The Doors of Perception, which documents his experience taking mescaline. The book became something of a Bible to the 60s generation and is said to have influenced the band name The Doors. I mention Aldous Huxley here, the notorious Aldous Huxley, because he was a friend of Sargant's and is featured on the back cover of the earlier mentioned Battle for the Mind, of Sargant's book Battle for the Mind. He's featured on the back of that book, recommending it. This very important book, he's quoted as stating on the back of Sargant's book. And just below him is a recommendation from none other than British philosopher Bertrand Russell. The Russell family name is actually the Duke of Bedford bloodline, dating back to the days of Henry VIII in the 16th century and the English town of Tavistock. In fact, when the Tavistock Clinic first opened its doors in 1920, it did so thanks to the Duke of Bedford Russell bloodline. Its very first premises was donated to the clinic by the then Duke of Bedford and was situated in Tavistock Square in Bloomsbury, London. And this is something I've talked about in quite a lot of detail in a previous video that came out in 2023 titled The Bloomsbury Tour, Social Engineers and the 60s UK Counterculture. There's also an article on my site Conspiromedia if you want to discover more about Sargant under the title The Experiments and Dark Details That Inspired a Famous 1960s Spy Story, and that takes a dive, that particular article takes a dive into the 1960s spy thriller movie The Ipcress File, based on the book of the same name, released in 1962. The film stars Michael Caine as the lead character of the story, a British intelligence operative who, whilst investigating the kidnapping of a top scientist who is then brainwashed whilst held captive, is also taken against his will. Caine's character is also taken against his will and placed under torturous mind control. The book's author, Len Dayton, partly based the brainwashing mind control elements of the story on information he'd gleaned from Sargant's Battle for the Mind. Jon Stock's The Sleep Room, a very British medical scandal, was published, if I'm not mistaken, in March 2025 in hardback, and from what I'm led to understand, the paperback will be published in March of 2026. Without a doubt, I'll be endeavouring to look closer into Sargant's career during my research into the 1960s British counterculture scene, which is ongoing. But as far as this presentation is concerned, this book review, I'll leave it here. Thank you for listening. Please do check me out regularly at my websites, Conspiromedia, which you can find at conspiromedia.wordpress.com. Also the Occult Beatles, theoccultbeatles.wordpress.com, or at the Conspiromedia Facebook page, where you'll find a mixture of info from my Conspiromedia and Occult Beatles WordPress sites, plus lots of other stuff. And then there's Conspiro TV at YouTube and also at Rumble and Odyssey, and my Spreaker page, which you can find by typing in Spreaker Conspiro Media Matt Sergio. Thank you for listening.